Audio Jungle. La Facultad de Ciencias Sociales promueve la reflexión crítica y busca soluciones frente a los temas complejos de la sociedad contemporánea, a través del trabajo académico y práctico entre profesoras, profesores, estudiantes, egresados, donantes y aliados. En nuestra facultad interactúan una gama amplia de disciplinas y formas de pensar la sociedad que promueven el análisis necesario para enfrentar los grandes desafíos de Colombia y la región en un contexto global. Las sociedades requieren de la riqueza que ofrecen los diversos puntos de vista de todas estas disciplinas y de actores que las ponen en debate. Bienvenidas y bienvenidos a la Facultad de Ciencias Sociales de la Universidad de los Andes.
Bueno, bienvenidas a este coloquio de Sociología o a esta charla magistral del coloquio de Sociología. Hoy tenemos el honor de tener como invitada a Myra Marx Ferree y además a tener una de nuestras egresadas, Yuri Saldarriaga, como comentarista de esta charla magistral. Entonces voy a cambiar esta charla, como contamos en el correo de invitación, será en inglés, entonces, pero al final tendrán posibilidad de plantear preguntas en español y nosotras podamos traducir. Entonces voy a cambiar ahora a inglés para introducir a Myra. Myra, thank you so much for being with us in this special talk of our sociology colloquium. And thank you also, Judy, for sharing with us with your comments. So today we'll have the first few minutes, we'll have Myra's talk, then we'll have some comments and questions from Judy. We'll provide Myra some time to react to those comments, and then we'll open for Q&A. So Myra, as many of you will know, is one of the classical sociologists in gender and feminist studies. She's emeritus, Alice Cook Emeritus Professor of Sociology at Universidad de los Andes and has had many different affiliations with different centers in both Europe and North America. And Yuri Saldarriaga is a graduate student, one of the graduates from our master's program. She already graduated last year in sociology, and she did her master's thesis on the struggles for the right for abortion in Colombia. So thank you both for being here, and Myra, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Abortion politics is one of those things that's large and complex and global. And it's part of both a feminist concern for autonomy and state control over populations. So individual and population dynamics are applicable. Back in the 1970s, a historian, Linda Gordon, made an important distinction. She talked about birth control, which is what women were interested in, the decision-making power, and population control, which is what states were interested in, controlling the size and makeup of their populations, and contraception, which is a technology, and abortion, which is a technology that can serve either of those purposes, or both of those purposes simultaneously. One of the things that's happened since the 1970s, when Linda Gordon made that distinction, is reproductive technologies have changed. Contraception and abortion and assisted reproduction have all become technologically far more sophisticated than they were in the 1970s, as well as being safer and much more accessible. contraception pills have been modified and adopted, and other long-acting contraceptives are available. Abortion has become safer and easier. There are pills there too. There is contraception that can be used immediately after a sexual encounter, as well as abortion pills for within the first 10 weeks. None of this was imaginable in the 1970s. So the technology has changed the feeling of what abortion and contraception are like. They're accessible, they're safe, and they're widely used. State policies and gender equality have also changed since the 1970s. The notion that reproduction only occurs in a single type of relationship, a heterosexual, monogamous, married couple, that's reproduction. This is at odds with how children are actually being born and actually being raised. Complex families are now not the exception, but the rule. That is to say, what's sometimes called serial monogamy or divorce and remarriage has produced step families, step children, multiple relationships among children and their parents. In addition, the ability to migrate transnationally has not ended family connections. It never did, but it made them very tenuous because of distance and communications technologies. Families now function transnationally, sometimes by choice, sometimes by necessity, at both ends of the economic and social spectrum. Immigrant families are often raising children transnationally, but so too are professional managerial class families who see opportunities for dual careers if one moves and the other stays, either in one country, staying behind in a country. For example, it's become very common in East Asia for professional managerial class mothers to migrate with their children to the US or to the UK, but fathers stay behind. In other cases, fathers are the ones who do the migration and mothers stay behind with the children. But the notion that transnational families are either just failed families or just families by necessity rather than by choice is very problematic. So we know now that children are being raised in complex, transnational, technologically facilitated relationships that may or may not be heterosexual, may or may not include marriage, may or may not be monogamous. But our imagining of families remains stuck in the idea that families and gender relations are the sources of stability in society. This is where things never change. Housework is eternal. Gender subordination always existed. Everything is sort of fixed in amber as if change were impossible. That's the imagination. Okay, men change as the economy changes. Women stay home and remain unchanging. That image of separate spheres has often guided people into mistaken notions of family stability. So you have people who are engaged in abortion politics in the US, at least, who are talking about the biblical family as if this were a monogamous and nuclear family with a man who was a breadwinner and a wife who, quote, stayed home to take care of the children. And we know, if we read our Bibles, that that is not true. Families were polygynous. There were all kinds of relations for passing wives among brothers. Families were certainly not nuclear. And the idea that somehow or another only men worked is certainly way more recent than the Bible. Women's labors in the Bible are very visible as well as men's. So how abortion rights are thought about, how rights in general for women are thought about, but abortion rights in particular, have become imagined in two contrasting ways. On the one hand, they may be thought of as good change. That is to say, these are technological changes and social changes that produce more opportunities for self-determination, more opportunities for women to participate in the parts of society that had been walled off and considered only for men, or they can be considered bad changes, part of the fact that gender and family change is happening, and thus social instability is being produced. The family is going to collapse, and with it, the whole society. That presumed stability, the nuclear family that has never changed, quote unquote, since biblical times, fantasy though it is, leads people to see change in family relations as destabilizing and disharmonious, as opposed to changing in ways that adapt to the technology, geography, and economy of the countries and conditions of the people who are trying to build families. So local and national politics take these reproductive issues that are global and changing in very specific directions. I've looked particularly at the US and Germany, and it's quite striking how differently both the state and individual women approach the question of birth control as a woman's right. Now, I'm not talking about population control yet, but this is the question of birth control. And West Germany really saw a feminist movement arise that was very woman specific. It had a focus on motherhood and childcare and the distinctiveness of women, and claimed very distinctively for women to have rights over against what were seen as oppressive male institutions, in particular, the churches and the doctors, also the judicial establishment and the state generally. Father state was not considered kind or supportive to women. East Germany initially had an idea that abortion rights were part of the accomplishments of socialism, that people should have a right to make their own lives in these ways. States should not intervene. It was good for the health and well-being of individual women. Abortion was still somewhat stigmatized, but under socialism, East Germany had a very permissive regime of abortion rights. Interestingly, during unification, East Germany distinctively had a way of talking about abortion by both men and women, and to some degree by both those who were in favor of more rights and those who were concerned about it, to talk about it as a matter of self-determination and the state not interfering where the state didn't belong. So a standard East German trope at the time of unification would be to say, we didn't fight for a society without walls to have West Germany make a new wall. And denying the right to abortion is a new wall. We fought to be able to think differently than the way the state did. And now the state is telling us what our rights are in terms of birth control. So the focus on the state was quite different. Ireland is another very interesting case where there had been extremely repressive politics about abortion, including a constitutional amendment forbidding abortion in all cases from the time of conception. And the Irish had a referendum and struck down that provision, overturned that constitutional, amended the Constitution to get rid of that particular constitutional obstacle. And it did so for two reasons. One is Ireland has a very strong sense of being pro-modernity. They want to be a modern country. They're turning modernity into a state goal. They're not worried about losing population, so the state's population control is not so limited, and being very emphatically pro-EU for both of those reasons. They're also, the Catholic Church lost an incredible amount of credibility in Ireland. Besides the state gaining credibility, the church lost credibility with the pedophilia of priests and the denial of that pedophilia, but also the exploitation of young women who had been pregnant and were sent off to these mother and child homes where they were worked sometimes literally to death, but where the conditions were brutal. The US has a very distinctive history of its own also. In the US, Roe versus Wade was the controlling constitutional decision. And it was passed in 1973 by the Constitutional Court. And the right that was extended was a right of privacy for women and their doctors. And that was always the reference, never women, but women, and a woman and her doctor has the right to make these decisions. And it defined abortion as a medical decision. And a medical decision is one that legislators would be very foolish to try to control, because it would create safety problems. And that is in fact why the cases came to the Supreme Court in the first place. There had been limited abortion rights that were very class specific. Women who had good connections with doctors could get a hospital committee to approve an abortion. But women who were poor, women who were not well served by the medical system, and in the US, because there is no national health system, many women are poorly served by the health system. Abortion was an unnecessary source of maternal mortality and infant mortality. So as a decision, it was much more about making abortion safe and giving doctors autonomy with individual women to make those decisions as women wished, which is, of course, what happens in other medical things. If you ask for a kidney transplant, no one can go to somebody and say, oh, you have an appropriate kidney, we want it. Let's take your kidney. And nobody can get a kidney transplanted into them unless they agree that that's the right thing to do. But pregnancy was put in an entirely different framework in terms of medicine. And the doctors' rights cause was one of saying we can't do good medical practice if we have to carefully stay clear of providing abortions. Hospitals were not enthusiastic about providing abortion, although in the first years, a number of people thought, well, of course they will be. They'll be very enthusiastic because they'll be able to make money on abortions. But they were really not enthusiastic about performing abortions. It didn't appeal to doctors as an area of practice for the most part. And we also see some interesting discussions emerging. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice, who's a feminist icon in the US, is often quoted by people who are anti-abortion as saying the Roe versus Wade decision was very problematic. The privacy right was a not very good way to decide on abortion rights. And the question is, why did she think that it was so problematic? She thought it should have been a women's rights decision. She expected Roe versus Wade was decided at a time when the Equal Rights Amendment was under debate in the United States, and the possibility of the United States having an Equal Rights Amendment in the Constitution seemed so likely, so probable that the notion that abortion would fall under an equal rights provision and prevent discrimination against pregnant women by virtue of the fact that they were pregnant was very strong. However, there was also a lot of resistance to the Equal Rights Amendment. That was what was focused on family issues, but not as focused on family issues as the German pro and anti-feminist movement. The Equal Rights Amendment, Germany has an Equal Rights Amendment and has had that Equal Rights Amendment since it existed as a state after World War II. The new founding after World War II put an Equal Rights Amendment in the Constitution from the get-go. But it was often limited in practice by judges' stereotypes about women's family roles. So yes, women have equal rights, but they have this responsibility for providing family care. So we can't do this and they can't do that, constantly being limited. The US did not pass an Equal Rights Amendment, but it also did not consistently affirm that women must be family members. In fact, the resistance to the Equal Rights Amendment was waged not in terms of protecting women's rights in the family, but in terms of preventing integration. Because integration, racial integration, had just been happening. And there was a lot of mobilized Southern sentiment about racial integration. And so the issues that surprisingly became the issues to stop an Equal Rights Amendment were, on the one hand, women's ability to serve in the armed forces, integrating the armed forces, which of course had just happened 2 decades before and was still an ongoing issue for Black and white service people, servicemen at that point. But to bring women into the military with equal rights, it was like, no, the Equal Rights Amendment will do that. That's terrible. And the other thing was ending the segregation of colleges and universities. And again, there was another bill passed, Title IX, of the Education Amendments, that carefully said, women can have separate education as long as it's of the same caliber as the education provided to men. But the notion of integration destroying all women's schools, the notion of integration, integrating the military, and finally the notion that the Equal Rights Amendment would bring men into women's bathrooms and women would be subject to male violence because you couldn't have just a woman's bathroom, which was nonsense, but was very effective in scaring people, particularly because bathrooms had just been racially integrated. And there were a lot of Southerners who were very concerned about this. At this point, many people see the US politics of abortion and assume that this politics of abortion, the opposition is coming from fundamentalist Christians because they've always been opposed to abortion. And that's not true. Catholics were, but Catholics in the US were also very worried that opposition to abortion would be seen as just a Catholic issue. So they were looking for allies. The fundamentalist Protestants, who were not terribly concerned about abortion, had been terribly concerned about integration. They were the ones mostly clustered in the South who were forming what were called segregation academies, ways to keep white and Black students apart. And so they tended to exploit the fears of integration to fight the Equal Rights Amendment. And as they fought the Equal Rights Amendment, they also got drawn into the anti-abortion movement. And we have lots of quotes from fundamentalists in the first 5 years after Roe versus Wade that say, it's not really our issue. It's not really our concern. But by the time 5 years roll along, let's say by 1980, it's become a fundamentalist issue. Catholics have an interest in making it a fundamentalist issue, so they're not standing by themselves trying to impose Catholic doctrine on the US. And fundamentalists have an interest in it as part of their interest in opposing the Equal Rights Amendment and opposing women's rights more broadly. And so the women's choice issue is what really echoes for fundamentalists, but then it becomes a whole fetal protection argument. So my point here is twofold. One is that reproductive rights are complicated. Reproductive rights include abortion rights, but are never just limited to abortion rights. So to talk about reproductive rights is also to talk about reproductive justice, is to talk about things like access to assisted reproductive technologies, contraception, the whole range of reproductive political decisions, and abortion is just one of those. Secondly, abortion in the 1970s was a very different thing than abortion now. Abortion as a choice has become a technologically advanced, undangerous procedure, which is in fact something like 10 times safer for women than pregnancy. Pregnancy remains dangerous, even though the opposition to abortion continues to present pregnancy as not dangerous and just women's natural state. It's part of motherhood, and women can't possibly need or want an abortion for any solid reason. And thirdly, abortion is in a context in which families are changing and reproduction is changing, and the structure of what it means to choose abortion. If you are also a person who has a career, and a family, or has a transnational family, or has a family that has been complexly reconstituted over several divorces and remarriages, or you are not married, but choosing partnership, and do you have the right partner yet in which to have a child? All of these kinds of family changes change the context in which abortion is considered even possible. So technologically, geographically, socially, abortion is a different thing now than it was when Roe versus Wade was passed. But the issues remain the same issues: population control, birth control, and access to the means in the hands of the state to control women, or for women to control their own fate. And every country, it's a different battle, because every country has a different state and a different women's movement. So that's my basic take home.
All right. Thank you so much, Myra, for this discussion on the intersectional nature of abortion politics. So now we'll hand the microphone, the virtual microphone, to Jury, who will provide comments.
Thank you, Angela. And thank you, Professor Ferree, for your presentation. It is really good to listen to you. I already read your paper, but I think that is very useful, all for the powerful, insightful ideas that you talk about gender and race and power and all the global interactions that, of course, are all so important. For me, it is especially important the way you understand gender from the relationship between different issues. I think that when we study gender, at least sometimes, we study from the social movements perspective or from the political parties perspective, but I think that it is very important to understand, like to assemble all of these ideas and try to understand gender from a comprehensive way. I really like the part of the paper, but also in the presentation when you mentioned that there are like two different umbrellas and two corners where a discussion about gender, but also about abortion are created. In one corner or under one umbrella, you place all of the conservative or like the ideas of the importance of families and the values of families and other issues, and on the other under the other umbrella you place the liberties of women, and how the social movements have to frame their discourses under one of these two positions. And I think that my first question is related to that, because I think that at least in your paper you mentioned that is something unique or something special in the United States because of the composition of the political parties, because you have like two strong political parties. But I think that we can extrapolate that to another countries and another regions, just like you mentioned, like this is the way of understanding gender from a global perspective. And I think that in Latin America we have the same issues. I think that we have a group of political parties or political perspective that prefer to talk about conservative values of families, the supremacy of men and that kind of stuff. And in another corner or under another umbrella, you find like people believing in the liberties of women. And I would like to ask, and that would be my first question. What do you think that is the difference from a global perspective, that in some countries, like in the United States, the balance tips in favor of some like more conservative ideas, like we just see in the decision of the Supreme Justice about abortion, while in other countries like in Mexico or Colombia or Argentina, you find that the balance tips in favor of the liberties of women. So that would be my first question for you, Professor. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think the answer is a complicated one, because I don't think that American voters or public opinion have moved in a conservative direction on abortion rights. In fact, the mobilization around abortion rights has been quite remarkable. Republicans on the right are discovering that women are registering to vote, women are voting down draconian rules. But remember, as in much of the world, the US is only partly incorporating women into the decision-making at the political institution level. Women are a quarter of the congressional decision makers. They're not half. That's way better than it was in the 1970s, but it's still not a situation in which you can count on women's ability to put through their agenda. And in fact, there are plenty of men who also support a women's rights agenda. They've built their lives around a notion of gender equality as well. So it's not just a woman's thing. But why does the US tip to the right when public opinion doesn't necessarily tip to the right? Well, because the political system is not set up to be wholly democratic. It's set up to give extra power to rural areas, extra power to small population states, extra power, in fact, to geographically concentrated population or geographically spread populations. So there's an awful lot of opinion in favor of abortion rights that is politically ineffective because it's clustered in what we can call blue spots in red states or blue states in a red background. And as long as the geography helps to sort people into one side or the other, the American system gives preference to the kind of geography that is conservative. And that, of course, has other consequences. There's some people who would say the whole Roe versus Wade decision comes not even from the general Republican leaning in a conservative direction and the electoral advantages of that, but the willingness of both Trump as president at the time and McConnell as the leader of the Senate to play what's sometimes called political hardball. That is to say, break the rules, bend the rules, invent rules, do things on the margins of legality. And if McConnell had not played political hardball by refusing to consider Barack Obama's nomination of someone to the Supreme Court, or by rushing through Trump's nomination when in fact the election was right around the corner, Trump would not have had 3 justices on the Supreme Court, and Roe versus Wade would not have been overturned, even though there were conservatives on the court beforehand.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
Right.
thank you.
Myra. Go ahead.
Can I ask another question? Okay, because I was wondering about the role of social movements too, because you just mentioned like the importance of politics and how that like played an important role in the final judicial decisions that made the judges. But I would like to know a little bit more about your perception of the influence of social movements in that decision, because I think that this is another great, like big part of the picture.
I think so too. And I think the anti-abortion movement has been very persistent and very focused for a long time as a social movement on this issue. To the extent that some people are making a joke about it's like the dog that chases a car. What does the dog do if he actually catches it? There's been this very persistent, you have to make abortion illegal everywhere, all the time, under all circumstances. And when the Supreme Court seems to go along with that, then a number of things emerge that are kind of embarrassing to the pro-life movement, because they've been busy saying, oh, pregnancy isn't dangerous. And then women are reporting how they nearly lost their lives. And I mentioned Ireland as a case. You can look also at other cases in other countries where social movements that have been anti-abortion have been dreadfully embarrassed by women who have died because the anti-abortion movement has so intimidated doctors that they are afraid to intervene until a woman is at the very brink of death. And then sometimes they can't bring her back from the brink of death. And so women have died in Sicily, women have died in Ireland, women have died in Germany, women have died in France. I'm sure that there are many women who also died across Latin America. When you can't intervene as a doctor, even if the country says, oh yes, when the woman's life is in danger, you can do something. But how do you define life in danger as opposed to simply critically ill?
Right. Thank you, Myra, for sharing with us this analysis of how the electoral process and how the political process shape abortion politics, and how recent changes have changed the field for different social movements. Jury, is it okay if I take a few questions around, and then we can maybe come back to you to pose one last question?
Okay, thank you.
All right, perfect. So I'm going to switch to Spanish to give an instruction to Alex, who's helping us with the logistics. Alex, te pido el favor que le habilites la cámara y el micrófono a todas las personas para que puedan hacer preguntas. All right, so please raise your hand or comment in the chat if you have a question, and you can open your microphone to pose the question, or you can write it in the chat and I'll read it out loud. Alex, ¿nos confirmas, porfa, cuando las cámaras y los micrófonos estén habilitados?
Ya están habilitados.
Perfect. All right, so anyone can turn on your cameras. Actually, for the Q&A, we would appreciate it if you do, because that makes it more dynamic. And again, feel free to raise your hand if you have questions, and I'll take a few, hopefully, this first round. Sí, gracias, Majo, por ese recorderis. Si alguien tiene preguntas en español, las puede hacer en español y podemos traducir. All right, so I'll give a few seconds in case people are shy to raise their hand.
Always.
Angela, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, Myra.
Hello.
I'm a researcher in Latin America, in Colombia, and I've seen that recently in Colombia, we have a lot of movements that supported abortion, and the Constitutional Court recently in Colombia approved an extension of the right of abortion. But there was a very polemic reaction about that because of the duration of the possibility of abortion. I don't know if in United States or other cases, the polemic or the reactions are on the right itself or its application, or on other issues first. And my second question is, what could social movements in North America learn from Latin American movements?
All
Okay,
right, thank you, Julie. Go ahead, Myra.
The second question, I think US movement can learn a lot from Latin American movements, because I think Latin American movements have been very effective at making sure that people understand that the right to abortion is anchored in the broader context of reproduction. So, one way to prevent many abortions is to improve access to contraception. And quality of medical care is involved in that as well. And so saying, being able to have good sex education, free access to contraception, and then to talk about abortion as a right on top of those, not all by itself, I think is something that's been very successful throughout Latin America, and I think is super important. The right to abortion is about protecting women's lives, and we can see that in Ireland, in Sicily, and now in the United States, where women are dying because the interpretation of abortion rights is one that leaves doctors feeling like their hands are tied, or that they could go to jail for intervening too soon to save a woman or to prevent a health risk. So yeah, I think I'm all for learning the Latin American model and using it in the US. The first question was
on the polemic, on the duration of the rights.
Yeah, it's more complicated in terms of the polemic. Of course, the polemic says, oh yes, women want the right to abortion up to the moment the baby is born. Polemically, they will say that. But the question of limiting time is, again, a medical question. Late abortions are very rare. Late abortions happen because it took that long to discover that the fetus has no brain or has no ability to live because of something wrong chromosomally or physiologically, that they simply cannot. It's a fatal anomaly is what the technical US term is. Fatal anomaly is not considered then a reason for abortion, and yet fatal anomalies are why you have abortions after 15 weeks. That and the other reason why abortions are later is because the restrictions are so tight that someone who wants to try to have an abortion in week 10 or week 12 has to come up with the money, arrange the transportation, go to a state where it's more available, and so on and so forth. And by the time she's done all of that, it might be week 16 or 17. So if you want the abortion to happen at week 10, you can say, that's a good thing. Then let's make it easy to do early. Let's make it safe to do early. And let's save late abortions for what they're mostly used for now, virtually entirely for cases of fatal anomaly, that things that will kill the baby, or things that have gone so wrong that the woman's life is immediately in danger. And usually fatal anomalies and are connected with stillbirth. The baby isn't born, the baby is there, but needs to be removed while it's still non-viable. And some of the deaths that have happened because doctors have been reluctant to intervene, even when the presence of a dead or dying fetus is killing the woman through septic shock. So we really need to think very carefully about what the technology, what medicine does these days, and what it can and can't do. And all of those week limits, do it by week 15, do it by week 12, do it by week 6, are crazy because they just go along with making it harder and thus later for women to actually be able to access it.
Yes,
They
thank
work
you.
against themselves. They're self-defeating in some ways.
Yes,
Thank you, Myra. And thank you, Julie, for that question.
That's a great question. Those are great questions.
What other questions are there? Judy or anyone in the audience?
May I?
Please.
I know as sociologists, we're not that good in telling things about the future, but we're very curious here about what will happen in the US. So what's your sense?
Hard to say, very, very hard to say. I think it's a battle that is, as they say, on a knife edge. I think it could go either way. And so I think it's very much a matter that is in our hands. How it happens, what goes on next, really depends on what people do. And sort of sitting and waiting to see what happens is not an ethical choice. There are an awful lot of people whose lives are at stake in all of this, and in a variety of ways, not just in terms of abortion rights, but in terms of their family rights, their ability to move in and around in the country. Immigration rights, I think, are also tied to abortion rights. Not only are children being abused at the border, but pregnant women are particularly likely to be the focus of aggressive anti-immigration enforcement, because having a child in the United States is to give that child US citizenship. And so at the US, and this is a very biased kind of enforcement too. It's very focused on the US-Mexican border. It's not focused on the US-Canadian border, and it's not focused on Chinese US immigration, where Chinese women who are professional managerial class women who are afraid that the country is moving in dangerous and politically repressive ways, want to have the US as an escape hatch. And so they leave China to have a child in the US. And that's a widespread, I mean, not widespread in the case of, hundreds of thousands, but it's a recognized form of immigration that's happening. And that's not what the polemic focuses on. The polemic focuses on degrading Spanish speakers and refugees from violence across Central and Latin America. And that's a politics in its own right. But my point is that collides with the politics of abortion and collides with the politics of birth and population control. And whose population do you want and not?
Right. Yes, thank you, Myra, for drawing those connections. And while like many of these things are seem scary, you also pose the issue of it depends on what people will do, and it's not an ethical choice to not do anything about it. Myra, if it works for you, there are 3 people in line, so I will take the 3 questions, and then you can respond to them. Okay, so
Yep.
Let's go first with Laura Novoa.
Hi, I'm sorry, I'm in a public space. Can you hear me well? Does that work?
Yes.
Okay, so I have 2 questions. The first question is, how does intersectionality, poverty, race, class, and all those things come into play when talking about abortion and reproductive rights legislation? And how can legislation on abortion rights be improved so that every single person that needs an abortion can have a safe procedure? Because, for example, here in Colombia, even though abortion is legal, there are still a lot of obstacles for women and people who need to access that service. So how could we, from legislation, improve the condition for all these people that need it?
Okay.
Thank you, Laura. We'll take the question from Felipe Chica. We can't hear you, Felipe.
You're probably muted.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. So I have a question regarding like the way that abortion has been legalized both in the US and here. So because of the initial judicial decision of Roe versus Wade, and now it being overturned by the same Supreme Court, there has been a lot of talk about stripping the Supreme Court of judicial review about especially of these types of cases, but also in others, so like gun control. Do you think it is appropriate, like that is an appropriate path to promoting re-legalization where it hasn't happened, I mean, where it's been criminalized again, of abortion? Or do you think judicial review is still important? Because, for example, that can be contrasted here because we see that abortion has not that large popular support here in Colombia as it does in the US. And so maybe here, if it wasn't for the Constitutional Court, we wouldn't be in this situation of legalized abortion, at least partially.
Thank you, Felipe. And let's go with Tatiana and Diana.
Thank you, Myra, for a great presentation. I love your broad understanding of sexual and reproductive rights. I wanted to ask you something about technology. And so we see that in many other women's issues, technology maybe doesn't develop as fast as in men's conditions. And I was wondering whether you think in both, in everything, in abortion, contraception, and IVF or other technologies for sexual and reproductive rights, technology has advanced as fast as we want it to. If yes, why? Given that it's such a controversial issue, especially in abortion and contraception. And if not, what are your thoughts about it and what to do?
Okay, three really great questions here. So let me start with the question about intersectionality. Yes, of course, reproductive rights are very intersectional, and the access to safe procedures is very much a question of class and race in the United States. The ability to limit women's access to safe medical care in general, but to reproductive care, good contraception. There's a lot of evidence. A former colleague of mine in Wisconsin, Jenny Higgins, has been doing really terrific work demonstrating unmet contraceptive need as a serious cause of women seeking abortions. That what they really wanted was contraception. But unmet contraceptive need is a real problem in terms of income, in terms of looking for abortions that might otherwise not have happened. If you don't really want a lot of abortions in your society, one of the things you do is you do a lot of good sex education and you do a lot of good contraceptive access intersectionally. But there's also an intersectional movement that has really emphasized that we're wrong to think about abortion as a choice. Abortion is often not a choice. Abortion is often a necessity under circumstances in which you have not got enough money to support the children you want to have, or even the children you already have. And so talking about it as a choice is often insulting to those women who find themselves being forced to have abortions. And so we really need a broader lens to talk about reproductive justice. And reproductive justice includes not just the right to have a safe abortion, but also to have safe childbirth. Black maternal and infant mortality in the US is at least twice as high as that of white mothers and infants. So safe childbirth, enough of an income protection and support for medically and socially for women to be able to choose to have children, that you cannot be fired if you get pregnant, for example. And that's not now the case. Employers can threaten to fire women who get pregnant because after all, they have, quote, the choice of abortion. So the point is not to reduce choices, but to make them broader and more inclusive, and not just say, gee whiz, abortions aren't available to poor women, or abortions are less available to Black women, but also to say pregnancy is very dangerous for Black women, and the ability to have a child is also limited. So it's not just a choice not to have a child, when you don't want to have a child, but also to have a child when you want to have a child. The second question was about abortion in the courts. And I think that the courts had the power to do undemocratic things. That's intrinsic to courts of any size and any composition in any country. They can do undemocratic things. The question is, why and how do they do undemocratic things? And for many years in the United States, the courts did undemocratic things in repressing workers' rights and saying workers had no right to strike, or that workers were not entitled to wage protection, and that employers could contract in ways to form monopolies. They could push down worker wages. So the courts were really undemocratic in a repressive way until the New Deal. And Franklin Roosevelt threatened to change the courts. And instead of him changing the composition of the courts by appointing any new justices, the justices that were there on the court at that time, as well as the new ones he appointed, and that Republicans and Democrats appointed for 20, 30 years after that, were more attuned to why they were doing undemocratic things. They were doing undemocratic things to protect minority rights, even if minorities hated a particular group. The courts protected them. They protected workers who were coming together to protect themselves against the combined power of employers. What's happened since the 1980s, so that was sort of true, if you will, from 1940 to 1980, the courts were protecting minority rights. Before that, not so much. They were protecting the rights of the people who had the most power. We have now moved from 1980 to the present, gradually in the direction of the American Supreme Court doing undemocratic things, if you will, for the wrong reasons. The reason courts have undemocratic power for the good reason that some things are not well decided by democracies, minority rights being very high on that list. And obviously things that can be manipulated in terms of ideas. If you can get a whole population to feel like we should go to war, you whip up nationalist fervor, courts can be there to say, hey, hold on. You can't just decide to start shooting people. You have to have a declaration of war. You have to go through Congress. There are rules about this. So there are undemocratic things for good reasons and undemocratic things for bad reasons. And I think one needs to look at the courts and look at ways to push the courts to consider their responsibility to protect minorities who need protection, or to protect the country from nationalist or fraudulent or otherwise problematic leadership. You want courts to stop dictatorships. You want courts to stop problems. You don't want courts to decide that the people who are rich should have more power. The people who are employers should be able to act unfairly towards workers. You don't want a whole variety of things that are giving those with power and extra power. You want the courts to be there to block undemocratic things in the name of those that don't have the power. So immigrants don't have much power, for example, but protecting immigrant rights and protecting the right to asylum, protecting the right to free speech, those are all things, those are undemocratic. People don't like free speech. They don't like people to say things they don't want to hear. But courts have a responsibility to do undemocratic things and protect fundamental rights. Has the technology moved as fast as desired? I think it's moved a lot faster, actually, on women's issues as well as on other issues. It's moved faster than social understanding of technology has moved. And so we can do a lot of things that we don't know what to do with. whether that's social media kinds of things or whether that's reproductive things. We don't know what to do. We don't understand what the social implications of technologies are. And courts are actually a very bad place to figure that out. We really need to have much more debate and discussion about climate change, for example, and how much technology can do for us and what it can't do, and which kinds of technologies we want and which kinds we don't. Those are social questions. And I think they're very important as democratic questions, as long as the courts don't interfere to make them undemocratic. And, you know, to say, oh, it's corporations or it's the donors or it's this or that who should have the final say. You know, if we can treat technological firms and technological innovators now the way the technological innovators were treated by people rising up and saying, wait a minute, we don't want it to go this way. We have some feelings about how this should go. That happened with the railroads, for example. That happened with the telegraphs. That happened with telephones, with people demanding that once there were telephones and once there was electricity, people should have access to electricity and telephones. And Roosevelt invested an enormous amount in creating public access to public technologies like electricity and telephone lines, and holding back the monopolies. We have not seen the modern monopolies held back. We have seen the courts kind of cave in and let them go. So I think we need a lot more social and political power and less reliance that technology by itself will do anything. Technology is not good or bad in and of itself. We have to be able to make the decisions, and I don't want the courts making those decisions solely. I mean, I want the courts standing up for the right of people to make these decisions. So I'm very pleased, for example, that the European Court of Justice said, you know, people have a right to opt out of having their information collected by these technology firms. And if the US Supreme Court were to do the same thing, I would consider that an undemocratic use of pro-democratic power. Give people the right to make these decisions.
Thank you, Myra. We have a question in the chat by Mathieu. So Mathieu, if you want to open your microphone, please do so. Otherwise, I'll read the question out loud. And I also want to ask Ferree if you have one last question. And if not, I'll use my privilege as the moderator to pose the question. So Mathieu, please open your microphone if you want. All right, then I'll read the question. So that's okay. Mathieu is telling us that he does not have a microphone on his workstation. So Mathieu says, fantastic talk. The social changes you mentioned at the outset make especially salient the need for a right to abortion. And those changes that he's referring to, that he mentioned, Myra, are complex family structures, transnational families, and so on. So the reversal of Roe versus Wade, in turn, seems historically wayward, again, in light of this trend. What do you think this means? Is that a momentary lapse? And does it mean that it's a momentary lapse and that the right to abortion will be brought back one way or another? Or that abortion politics have become so entrenched that what happens next will remain uncertain? So that's Mathieu's question. Jury, do you want to pose a final question, only if you want to?
No, I don't have more questions.
Okay, perfect. So I'll pose another question on top of that one. And my question is, Myra, you've discussed this like different umbrellas that these debates happen under. And I was curious to what extent, like analyzing those different umbrellas or the ways abortion rights are differently framed, for instance, in the US and Germany. Based on that analysis, do you have an idea of how much space do social movements, pro-women's rights social movements have in terms of how to frame the debates? Like what, how much agency is there for the social movements, or is there, how much space for agency of how to frame the debates is there? Or does it depend on, like the relative predominance of each umbrella at the state, at the Congress and court level?
Okay, again, great questions. Let me start from the last and work backwards, because I think that's a good question. One of the reasons I chose the metaphor of an umbrella is that you don't necessarily have everybody under that umbrella agreeing with each other. It's not like one front or one big movement, and people who talk about like the new right or the democratic progressives tend to turn what are actually a diversity of social movements into blocks of people. And the party system encourages us to see each umbrella as covering a block of people who are more homogeneous than they really are. There is diversity under those umbrellas. The umbrellas are constructed for political purposes. And so one of the important things, I think, for us who are involved in social movements and trying to take agency in how we frame these things is to frame them in ways that emphasize that diversity and pull away from the it's all one big umbrella. And everybody who agrees with any one of these issues will agree with all of them. Yes, the tendency there is for people under all of these, all of these different social movements to pick one party over the other, but it doesn't mean that they pick all of their companion movements as being right. So people who may be anti-abortion may be also anti-gun safety, anti-gun control, but they may not be. They may draw the line at we want to protect life. We say we are pro-life, so we do want to protect unborn children, but we also want to protect children in schools, in families, in parks. We want gun safety, right? So then why are you voting for Republicans just because you're, quote, pro-life on the abortion issue? Can't you be more supportive of social welfare measures than the Republicans are, even if they're, quote, pro-life and they support a particularly restrictive anti-Roe versus Wade kind of approach, even if they're organizing to make abortion restricted to the first 6 weeks or to limit the extent to which it protects women's lives. All of those kinds of things, that there's no reason to assume that just because the Republican Party puts an umbrella over that and the gun control movement and the climate change denial movement, that we have to buy into that. It's not necessarily all the same. And I think one of the things that's making it clear that we have a lot of agency to pull these things apart is to talk about climate change. Because that's one of those things where, yes, there are two umbrellas. Yes, the two parties are clearly aligned differently on climate change, but people themselves haven't made up their minds so much. They're not voting for Republicans and Democrats because of their opinions on climate change. those opinions on climate change are in the political class and in the people who are elected. There's a coherence there. But we can start pulling voters apart on that. And we can also start pulling voters apart on the question of how climate change is related to population control. Do we really want a situation in which only states get to decide to limit population or not to limit population? I mean, China tried that and tried to say, you can only have one child, and then it was only 2 children. And now it's like going like, oh dear, what are we going to do for workers? We better have 3 children or have as many children as you want. States make very bad decisions on population. And so thinking through, how is population control or population an issue that is also tied to climate? If climate change is the crisis that I think it is, and if we're really concerned about what climate change is doing to people, not just inside our borders, but internationally, transnationally, then we ought to be saying we should be thinking about a future in which climate refugees are going to be a large part of the global population. So what are we going to do? Are we going to close our borders tightly and try to get our people to reproduce themselves as amply as possible? Or are we going to say, hey, having smaller families is really good, and creating space for people to come in and fill new spots in the global economy in your neighborhood is also a good thing, because people are not going to be able to stay where they are. It's just going to be a fact. A technological, geographical reality that we're going to have to deal with. Immigration is not going to go away. Climate refugees are going to be like political refugees, like economic refugees, an increasing part of the global mobility that we all live with. So is Roe versus Wade a retrograde decision all by itself that's just going to fall because we're all going to get progressive on all of these matters, and all of the technological change and geographical change will mean that we will have to make better decisions on things like reproductive rights? Doesn't work that way, unfortunately. Societies make decisions that are often very bad for them. They keep out immigrants when immigrants would be positive additions to the country. They do stupid things like the UK did with Brexit. They do stupid things like the US did with Roe versus Wade. But those are not necessarily easily reversible. And saying it was a stupid thing after the horses left the barn doesn't put the horse back in the barn. The change has happened. Now what? What are we going to do? Are we going to try to revive Roe versus Wade, or are we going to pass an equal rights amendment and put abortion under the coverage of an equal rights amendment, which is what Ruth Bader Ginsburg expected to happen? Are we going to make abortion more clearly part of a reproductive justice agenda that also involves supporting children after they're born and supporting mothers from the beginning of pregnancy with pregnancy leaves and motherhood leaves and things that don't exist in the US? If we wanted a reproductive justice agenda, it's not going to come just by going back to saying abortion is a choice that should be private, which is what Roe versus Wade said, because private choice is insulting to women who have to have abortions for reasons that are by no means private. And it's not a just choice in saying, oh yes, it can be available like other healthcare when not everybody can access healthcare. Returning to Roe versus Wade is not a good goal. Let's go beyond Roe versus Wade and let's make reproductive justice a goal, and let's institutionalize a broader set of rights to safe childbearing and childbearing and real self-determination in having a child or not having a child.
Thank you so much, Myra, and thank you so much for this amazing and engaging talk. I leave with many ideas. My notes are, full of issues I'll keep thinking about, but there's two that, I think I'm finding especially rich. So one is the thing about how we don't necessarily, even after, redressing rights, we don't necessarily want to go back to what there was, but we can fight for something better and more just. And the second thing is that we need to think this things along different dimensions and think about gender and reproductive rights in line with the social understanding of technology and immigration and climate change. And that is what sociology helps us do, right? Like draw those connections and see how we can fight for more just social change along those lines. So thank you so much, Myra, for your messages, for being here, for your time, for sharing with us. And we hope to maybe, continue these conversations with you.
Great fun. Thank you very much. I'm so glad you invited me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
All right.
you.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone. Thank you for being
Bye.
here.
Thank you, Julie, too.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you, Jerry, for your comments
welcome.
and your questions.
Con gusto. Chao.
Ciao.
Chao, que estén bien.